February 12, 1945, 2:47 in the morning. The Westhofen district of Cologne, Germany. The air is frigid, just below freezing. A light fog hangs over the Rhine River, thick enough to obscure vision beyond 50 meters. In a concrete pillbox overlooking the eastern approach to the Hohenzollern Bridge, Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich sits behind a mounted MG-42 machine gun, scanning the darkness through a vision slit no wider than a man's hand. He has been awake for 19 hours. His eyes burn. His fingers are numb inside their gloves. But he doesn't move. He can't, because somewhere out there, in the blackness beyond the wire, the Americans are coming. Dietrich commands what military theorists would call a perfect offensive position. Behind him stands Cologne Cathedral, one of the most fortified cities in the Third Reich. In front of him stretches 400 meters of open ground, the killing zone. No cover, no concealment, just flat earth seeded with S-mines, Teller mines, and concertina wire stacked 8 feet high. Beyond that, the ruins of the industrial district where British bombers have turned factories into skeletal steel frameworks and rubble fields. Any attacking force must cross that open ground. In daylight, it would be suicide. At night, with flares and overlapping fields of fire, it should be impossible. Dietrich has 42 men in interconnected bunkers. They have ammunition for 3 days of sustained combat. They have orders to hold until relieved or until they are dead. But as Dietrich stares into the fog, something is wrong. The darkness feels occupied, not empty, but populated by something he cannot see. His radio man reports no movement. His forward observers see nothing. The listening posts hear nothing. But Dietrich's instincts, honed through 2 years of Eastern Front combat, are screaming that the enemy is already here. At 2:49 a.m., a single shot cracks through the silence. Then nothing. Dietrich keys his radio. Report. Silence. He tries again. Listening post 1, report. Static. He switches frequencies. Listening post 2, respond. Nothing. He grabs his field telephone, hand cranking the ringer. The line to his rear command post is dead. Cut. All of them. In the span of 2 minutes, his entire communication network has been severed without a sound. Dietrich's throat tightens. He stands, leaning into the vision slit, scanning desperately for movement. The fog swirls. The wire fence looks intact. The minefield is undisturbed. There are no flares, no explosions, no screams. Just silence. Then, from directly below his bunker, a sound. Soft, rhythmic, the scrape of a boot on concrete. Someone is underneath him. Someone has bypassed 400 meters of fortifications without triggering a single mine, without being seen by a single sentry, and is now planting explosives against the foundation of his command post. Dietrich opens his mouth to shout a warning. The bunker erupts. The explosion lifts the entire concrete structure 6 inches off its foundation and drops it at an angle. The MG-42 tears loose from its mount. Dietrich is thrown against the rear wall. His ears ring. Smoke fills the chamber. He grabs for his Mauser. When he staggers to the firing slit, coughing, he sees them. Figures. Dozens of them. Moving across the killing zone in absolute silence. They do not run. They glide. They move through the wire like smoke, stepping over mines that should have been invisible in the dark. They are not using flashlights. They are not stumbling. They move with the precision of men who can see in total blackness. Dietrich fires. His men fire. Tracers arc into the fog. But the figures do not stop. They do not even slow. They flow around the bunkers, vanishing into blind spots, reappearing behind positions. Within 8 minutes, every forward bunker on Dietrich's line has gone silent. Not overrun. Silenced. No explosions. No firefights. Just radio silence and darkness. By 3:15 a.m., Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich is a prisoner. His perfect defense has collapsed in 28 minutes. He is standing in the ruins of a command post, hands on his head, surrounded by men who move through his fortress like it was made of air. When a young American lieutenant asks him in broken German how many casualties his unit suffered, Dietrich answers honestly, 41 captured, 1 dead from the initial breaching charge. The Americans took his entire defensive line, without losing a single man. The lieutenant smiles and says, in English Dietrich doesn't understand. Night fighters don't leave bodies. We don't even leave footprints. We are not just looking at a battle. We are looking at the most radical training experiment in military history, an experiment that turned ordinary soldiers into something German doctrine had no answer for. Men who could see in the dark, men who could navigate minefields by touch, men who became, quite literally, invisible to an enemy that owned the night. This is the story of how the U.S. Army weaponized darkness itself, and how one general's obsessive experiment in sensory deprivation broke the most fortified defensive line in Western Europe. To understand why Cologne's defenses were considered impregnable, you have to understand what the Wehrmacht had built there. This was not a hastily constructed fortification. This was a surgical expression of German defensive engineering, a system designed to kill with geometric precision. The West Wall, or Siegfried Line, was 390 miles of interconnected fortifications stretching from Switzerland to the Netherlands. But Cologne represented something more sophisticated, a layered defense built around industrial choke points and river crossings. The Hohenzollern Bridge was the last intact rail link across the Rhine in the sector. Losing it meant severing the Ruhr industrial region from the rest of Germany. Hitler had personally ordered it held to the last bullet, the last man. The defensive structure was a masterpiece of interlocking kill zones. The outer ring consisted of dragon's teeth, pyramidal concrete obstacles designed to stop tanks. Behind that, minefields, the S-mine, nicknamed the Bouncing Betty, was a spring-loaded explosive that launched 3 feet into the air before detonating, sending 360 steel balls in a radius that could shred a man at 30 meters. The mines were pressure-triggered at 15 pounds, light enough that a careless step would detonate them, but heavy enough that wind or animals wouldn't set them off. Behind the mines, wire, not simple barbed wire, but concertina wire, coiled razor wire stacked in pyramids 8 feet tall and 20 feet deep. Trying to cut through it in daylight took engineers 20 minutes per breach. At night, it was a death sentence. The wire was designed to channel attackers into fire lanes where pre-sighted machine guns could engage at maximum efficiency. The bunkers themselves were architectural nightmares for attackers. Reinforced concrete, 3 feet thick, angled at 30 degrees to deflect artillery. Vision slits no wider than 6 inches, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Each bunker could cover its neighbor. If one was suppressed, the adjacent position could deliver enfilade fire, crossfire that turned any advance into a slaughterhouse. The MG-42 machine gun, the cornerstone of the defense, fired 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast that the individual shots blurred into a continuous ripping sound. American soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw. One sustained burst could cut a man in half. One gun, properly positioned, could hold an entire company at bay for hours. And all of this was designed to function at night. German doctrine emphasized night defense. Flares turned darkness into blinding daylight for 30 seconds at a time. Searchlights mounted on bunkers could sweep the killing zones. Interlocking fields of fire meant that even if attackers moved in darkness, the moment they triggered a flare or a mine, they would be illuminated and destroyed. The numbers were brutal. In January 1945, when American forces first probed Cologne's outer defenses, casualties were catastrophic. The 99th Infantry Division lost 200 men in a single night attempting to breach a fortified village 12 miles west of the city. They gained 400 yards. At that rate, reaching the Rhine would cost 20,000 casualties. Battalion commanders sent reports up the chain. Night attacks are not feasible against prepared German positions. Enemy has total control of darkness through illumination and defensive fires. Recommend daylight assaults with air and artillery support. But daylight assaults meant urban warfare. To the rubble of Cologne, a city of 1 million reduced to a skeletal framework by Allied bombing. The Germans were experts at rubble defense. Stalingrad had taught them that a determined defender in ruins could hold for months. Every cellar was a bunker. Every pile of brick was a sniper nest. The Soviets had paid in blood for every block of Stalingrad. Eisenhower's planners estimated that taking Cologne through conventional urban assault would cost 15,000 American casualties and take 6 weeks. 6 weeks they did not have. The Rhine crossings were scheduled for March. The bridgehead at Remagen had to be secured. The Ruhr pocket had to be closed. Cologne could not become another Stalingrad. This was the citadel, a fortress city defended by men who had survived the Eastern Front, armed with weapons designed to dominate the night. Positioned behind obstacles that had been refined through 4 years of total war. Breaking it required something the German defenders had never encountered. It required soldiers who did not need light to see. The first attempt to create night-capable infantry was a disaster, and it started with a man who wasn't supposed to be in the army at all. Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen was, by every conventional measure, an unlikely candidate to revolutionize infantry tactics. He had severe dyslexia, a condition that nearly prevented his admission to West Point. He entered the academy through what he called the back door, a special appointment after another candidate failed a physical. He graduated near the bottom of his class. His spelling was atrocious. His paperwork was illegible, but his understanding of violence was surgical. Allen had commanded the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, through North Africa and Sicily. He was loved by his soldiers and hated by his superiors. Eisenhower relieved him in 1943 for a lack of discipline, which meant Allen allowed his men to loot, drink, and brawl because he believed aggressive soldiers off the battlefield made aggressive soldiers on it. But by late 1944, with casualties mounting and the German defensive lines hardening, Eisenhower needed Allen back. He was given command of the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves, and a mission: break the German night defense doctrine. Allen's first insight was simple. American soldiers were terrified of the dark. This was not cowardice. It was conditioning. From childhood, humans are taught to fear what they cannot see. Darkness equals vulnerability. The Germans weaponized this fear. Their flares, their searchlights, their sudden illumination of killing zones, all of it was designed to induce psychological paralysis in attackers. And it worked. In December 1944, Allen conducted an experiment. He took a company of infantrymen and ordered them to conduct a night patrol without flashlights or flares. The patrol lasted 3 hours. The results were catastrophic. Men walked into trees. They fell into ditches. They fired at shadows. 3 soldiers shot each other in confusion. One man fell into a stream and nearly drowned because he couldn't see the water in the darkness. The after-action report was damning. Unit cohesion disintegrates in total darkness. Soldiers experience severe anxiety and disorientation. Without artificial illumination, infantry cannot function offensively at night. But Allen saw something different in that failure. He saw that the problem wasn't darkness. It was unfamiliarity. His soldiers couldn't function in the dark because they had never trained in the dark. They had spent their entire lives in a world where darkness was temporary, where a light switch was always available. They had no neurological adaptation to operating without sight. Allen proposed something radical: mandatory darkness training. Not just night exercises with partial moonlight. Total darkness. Sensory deprivation on an industrial scale. The Army rejected the proposal. Training doctrine emphasized efficiency. Daylight training allowed instructors to observe and correct mistakes. Night training was expensive. It required double the instructors, double the safety protocols, and produced half the observable results. The War Department's training manual explicitly stated, night operations should be trained during final unit preparation, not individual soldier training. Allen ignored the manual. In January 1945, he instituted what became known as the night system. Every soldier in the 104th Infantry Division would spend 35 hours per week training in complete darkness. Not dim light, not twilight. Total, absolute, uninterrupted blackness. The training facility was a series of buildings near the division's bivouac area in Belgium. Windows were blacked out. Electric lights were removed. Soldiers entered at 6 p.m. and did not emerge until 6 a.m. 12 hours of darkness, 5 nights per week for 6 weeks. The first week was psychological torture. Men sat in rooms so dark they could not see their hands in front of their faces. They were ordered to assemble and disassemble their rifles by touch. The first attempts took 40 minutes. Soldiers fumbled with parts, dropped bolts, trigger assemblies. Instructors, using night vision equipment captured from German snipers, watched from the shadows and offered no help. If you can't find it, you don't need it, one instructor said when a soldier lost a firing pin in the darkness. Navigation training was worse. Soldiers were placed in a pitch-black warehouse filled with obstacles, barrels, wooden crates, coiled wire. They were ordered to move from one end to the other without making a sound. The first night, every soldier failed. They knocked over barrels. They tripped over wire. One man walked face first into a steel support beam and broke his nose. The psychological effects were severe. Soldiers reported hallucinations, seeing lights that didn't exist, hearing voices in the silence. Some experienced claustrophobia so intense they had to be removed from training. One soldier suffered a panic attack and had to be physically restrained. Medical officers reported that 18% of trainees experienced acute anxiety during the first week. But Allen didn't stop. He increased the difficulty. Week 2, soldiers were blindfolded during the day to extend their sensory deprivation. They ate blindfolded. They cleaned their weapons blindfolded. They conducted physical training blindfolded. The goal was neurological adaptation, forcing the brain to rewire itself to prioritize non-visual senses. Week 3, live fire exercises in total darkness. Soldiers fired at targets they could not see, using only sound and memory terrain to estimate range and direction. The first exercises were catastrophic. Soldiers fired wildly. Rounds went into berms, into the sky, into each other's positions. One platoon nearly shot their own machine gun team because they couldn't identify the sound of a friendly weapon versus an enemy weapon in the confusion. But by week 4, something changed. Soldiers began to see without light. Not metaphorically, neurologically. Their pupils dilated to maximum capacity, capturing every photon of ambient light. Their night vision adapted to levels previously thought impossible for untrained personnel. But more importantly, their other senses sharpened. They learned to navigate by sound, to hear the difference between stepping on grass versus gravel, to identify the creak of a wooden fence versus the rattle of wire, to distinguish the click of a German mine trigger from the snap of a twig. They learned to navigate by touch, to feel air currents indicating open doorways, to sense the texture change where pavement met dirt, to detect the vibration of footsteps through the ground. By week 6, soldiers could assemble a rifle in 90 seconds in total darkness. They could navigate obstacle courses without making a sound. They could identify enemy positions by the smell of cigarette smoke or the metallic tang of gun oil. They had become, in Allen's words, predators of the night. But the true test wasn't in a training warehouse. It was in the frozen ruins of Cologne, against an enemy that had never encountered soldiers who didn't need eyes to kill. The physics of night combat is not about courage. It is about incompressible matter and the transmission of energy through mediums the enemy believes are dead zones. This is the part most histories ignore. They focus on bravery, on heroism, on men charging into darkness. But the night fighters didn't charge. They calculated. Because Allen understood something fundamental. Darkness is not the absence of information. Darkness is an environment rich with data, if you know how to read it. The first technical breakthrough was understanding shockwave propagation through soil. When a soldier steps on the ground, the impact creates a pressure wave. In daylight, this is irrelevant. Vision dominates all other senses. But in total darkness, those pressure waves become detectable at distances up to 15 meters for trained personnel. The human foot striking earth generates a shock wave traveling at approximately 340 meters per second through loose soil, faster through compacted earth. Night fighters were trained to feel these vibrations through the soles of their boots. They learned to distinguish between the impact pattern of a 180-pound American soldier and a 160-pound German soldier. They learned to detect the difference between a deliberate patrol step and a nervous sentry shifting weight. This wasn't supernatural. This was neurological adaptation. The mechanoreceptors in human skin, Pacinian corpuscles, can detect vibrations at frequencies below the threshold of conscious perception, but only if the brain is trained to prioritize tactile input over visual input. The 35-hour darkness regimen rewired that priority. The second breakthrough was auditory triangulation. The human ear can detect sound source direction with approximately 3-degree accuracy in optimal conditions. But optimal conditions assume daylight, where the brain cross-references audio input with visual confirmation. In total darkness, trained soldiers could achieve 1-degree accuracy by isolating audio input and using binaural time differences, the microsecond delay between the sound reaching the left ear versus the right ear. Night fighters trained with what Allen called acoustic mapping. They sat in darkness and listened to recordings of German equipment, the rattle of MG-42 belt feeds, the click of Mauser bolt actions, the scrape of jackboots on concrete. They learned to identify not just the sound, but the distance and direction based on acoustic decay and environmental reflection. This training allowed them to do something German defenders considered impossible: navigate minefield by sound. An S-mine trigger mechanism emits a faint click, approximately 40 decibels at 1 meter, when the pressure plate is compressed to 14 pounds. Most soldiers never hear this click because they are stepping down with 15-plus pound of pressure and detonating the mine instantly. But a trained soldier, stepping lightly, can hear the trigger engage, freeze mid-step, and redistribute weight backward before crossing the detonation threshold. The night fighters practiced this for hours. They walked through dummy minefields where instructors had placed pressure plates rigged to buzzers instead of explosives. The goal was to cross the field without triggering a single buzzer. The first week, every soldier failed. By week 6, 60% could cross without a sound. But the most devastating technical advantage was thermal gradient detection. The human body radiates heat at approximately 100 watts. In cold environments, like February in Germany, that heat creates a detectable thermal signature. German sentries, standing in concrete bunkers, radiated warmth that dissipated into the freezing night air. Night fighters learned to detect these gradients by feel, by sensing the slight temperature increase when approaching an occupied position versus an abandoned one. This seems impossible. It is not. The thermoreceptors in human skin can detect temperature changes as small as 0.01 degrees Celsius. But this sensitivity is suppressed in normal conditions because visual input dominates. Remove visual input for 35 hours per week, and the brain reprioritizes thermal detection. Night fighters described it as feeling warmth in the air. They could sense an occupied bunker from 10 meters away, simply by detecting the thermal bloom of body heat escaping through vision slits and ventilation gaps. The final technical element was what Allen called geometric violence, the surgical application of explosives to bypass fortifications without triggering defensive fires. Night fighters carried satchel charges weighted to exactly 12 pounds, heavy enough to breach concrete, light enough to be placed silently. They were trained to approach bunkers from blind spots, angles where the vision slits could not observe, and place charges against foundations rather than walls. Why foundations? Because concrete fortifications are only as strong as the earth beneath them. A 12-pound charge detonated against a foundation doesn't destroy the bunker. It lifts it. The explosion creates a vertical shock wave through incompressible soil that transfers kinetic energy directly into the structure, popping it off its base like a cork from a bottle. The bunker remains intact, but becomes structurally unstable. The occupants are concussed but not killed, which means prisoners, not bodies. And prisoners can be interrogated. This was not taught in any manual. This was Allen's innovation, born from his understanding that the goal was not to kill Germans. It was to collapse their defensive system without triggering their response protocols. Dead sentries meant alarms. Concussed sentries meant silence. By February 1945, the 104th Infantry Division had become something the Wehrmacht had no doctrinal answer for. They were not elite commandos. They were not special forces. They were ordinary infantrymen who had been neurologically rewired to operate in an environment German defenders believed they controlled. The Germans owned the night through technology, flares, searchlights, infrared scopes. The night fighters owned the night through biology. And biology, it turned out, was faster than a flare could rise. February 12, 1945, 2:30 a.m. 30 companies of the 104th Infantry Division's 415th Regiment moved into position along a 2-mile front west of Cologne. They carried no radios. Radios require operators to speak, and speech breaks silence. They carry no flashlights. Flashlights create signatures. They move in absolute blackness, navigating by touch and sound, toward fortifications that have held against every previous assault. The plan is surgical. 3 phases, each designed to exploit the single greatest weakness in German night defense doctrine, the assumption that darkness belongs to the defender. Phase 1, infiltration, 0230 to 0300 hours. Night fighters move across the 400-meter killing zone in teams of 4. They do not walk in formation. They do not follow lanes. They move as individuals, each taking a different path, each navigating independently, using techniques trained over 210 hours of darkness. The lead scouts carry no weapons, only long wooden probes. They move at 5 meters per minute, sliding the probe ahead of each step, feeling for the pressure plates of S-mines. When they detect a mine, they mark it with small claw strip treated with phosphorescent paint visible only through night-adapted eyes at close range. Behind them, the assault teams follow the marked paths. The wire obstacles are bypassed, not breached. Night fighters carry wire cutters, but cutting wire makes sound, a snip that carries 30 meters in still air. Instead, they lift the wire. The concertina wire is stacked in coils held together by tension. Cut one strand, and the entire coil collapses, creating a sound like a steel avalanche. But lift the coil carefully, and a man can slip underneath without triggering the collapse. It takes 4 minutes to lift a coil high enough for one man to crawl through. It makes no sound. Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich, in his bunker 200 meters ahead, hears nothing. His sentries see nothing. His listening posts, positioned 50 meters forward, report all clear, but those listening posts are already dead. Not killed, silenced. Night fighters reach them at 0242 hours, approaching from behind using the sound of the defender's own breathing to locate them in darkness. A hand over the mouth, a knee in the back, a whispered order in German, quiet or die. The sentries, paralyzed by the impossibility of men appearing from nowhere, surrender without a sound. They are gagged, bound, and left face down in the mud. Phase 2, breaching, 0300 to 0315 hours. Assault teams reach the bunker line. They do not attack. They listen through the concrete. They can hear the Germans inside, the shuffle of boots on cement, the metallic clink of machine gun belts being adjusted, the low murmur of conversation. They use these sounds to map the interior layout. Where's the MG-42? Where's the ammunition? Where are the occupants positioned? One team reaches Dietrich's command bunker. They move along the exterior wall, feeling for the ventilation shaft, a 6-inch steel pipe protruding from the foundation to prevent carbon monoxide buildup. They find it at 0307 hours. A soldier uncaps a canister of CN gas, chloracetophenone, a tear gas compound. He inverts the canister over the ventilation shaft and counts to 30. Inside the bunker, the air turns to acid. Eyes burn, throats close. Men double over, choking, desperate for air. At 0309 hours, the demolition team places a 12-pound satchel charge against the bunker's foundation. They do not use a timer. Timers tick. They use a pull-friction igniter, a device that detonates when a wire is yanked, creating a spark. The team attaches a 20-meter wire to the igniter, retreats to a safe distance, and pulls. The explosion is not loud. It is a deep, subsonic thump that travels to the ground more than the air. The bunker rises 6 inches, tilts, and settles at a 15-degree angle. The MG-42 tears loose from its mount. Dietrich is thrown against the wall. The vision slit, previously aligned with the killing zone, now points at the sky. Before the dust settles, night fighters are inside. They enter through the rear access hatch, a steel door designed to open inward. The explosion popped the door frame, and the door swings open freely. The Germans inside are concussed, disoriented, gasping for air. They do not resist. They cannot. The psychological shock of an enemy appearing inside their fortress without triggering a single alarm has paralyzed them more effectively than gas or explosives. At 0315 hours, Dietrich's entire defensive line, 14 bunkers, has been neutralized without a single shot fired. Not one flare has been launched. Not one alarm has been sounded. From the German rear command post, The situation appears normal. All listening posts report all clear, because the listening posts are now operated by Americans whispering responses in German. Phase 3, exploitation, 03:15 to 03:45 hours. With the forward defenses collapsed, the main assault waves move through. They advance in columns of 4, navigating by following phosphorescent markers placed by the lead scouts. They carry rifles but do not fire them. Firing creates muzzle flash, which creates signatures, which triggers response. Instead, they move through the German secondary positions using the same infiltration techniques. By 03:30 hours, American infantry are inside Cologne's outer suburbs. They have advanced 800 meters through fortifications designed to require 3 days of fighting. They have taken 127 prisoners and suffered 0 casualties. The German defensive system has not failed. It has been bypassed at a neurological level. The defenders never saw what killed them because what killed them didn't need to be seen. At 03:45 hours, Dietrich is led past the ruins of a command post. In the pale pre-dawn light, he can see the paths the night fighters took through his minefield. The routes are impossible, winding between mine casings that should have been invisible in darkness. He asks the American captors, in halting English, how they saw the mines. The lieutenant, the same one who will later explain that night fighters leave no bodies, smiles and says, "We didn't see them. We felt them." Dietrich does not understand. He will not understand for years when he reads the declassified training manuals and realizes that the Americans had done something the Wehrmacht considered theoretically impossible. They had trained soldiers to operate in total darkness, not by giving them equipment, but by changing their biology. The night fighters broke Cologne's defenses in 72 hours. By February 15th, the city's western districts were in American hands. The Hohenzollern Bridge, the last Rhine crossing, was captured intact on March 6th when German demolition teams were overrun before they could detonate the charges. The Ruhr pocket was closed. The war in Western Europe entered its final phase. But the significance of the night system extended far beyond one battle. Terry Allen had proven something that contradicted a fundamental assumption of modern warfare, that technological superiority decides battles. The Germans had better night vision equipment, infrared scopes, superior optics, advanced searchlights. But technology requires power sources, maintenance, and operators trained to use it. Biology requires only time and repetition. The night fighters demonstrated that the human nervous system, subjected to prolonged sensory deprivation, rewires itself to compensate. This was not superhuman. It was neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize synaptic connections in response to environmental demands. Soldiers who spent 35 hours per week in total darkness didn't gain supernatural abilities. They recovered abilities that evolution had given them and modern civilization had suppressed. There's a deeper lesson here about fortifications and the illusion of invincibility. Cologne's defenses were not weak. They were geometrically perfect, mutually supporting, and manned by veterans who had survived the Eastern Front. But they were designed to fight an enemy that operated within the same sensory framework as the defenders. The moment that framework changed, the moment attackers no longer needed light to see, the entire defensive philosophy collapsed. This is the paradox of military innovation. The Wehrmacht spent billions of Reichsmarks fortifying the Rhine. They built bunkers that could withstand 155 millimeters artillery. They laid minefields that stretched for kilometers. They trained their soldiers in night defense doctrine refined over 4 years of total war. And all of it was bypassed by an American general who realized that the most powerful weapon was not steel or explosives. It was adaptation. When you fight an enemy that can rewire the human brain to operate in your blind spots, no fortress is strong enough. When you design defenses that assume the enemy needs the same environmental inputs you do, you create a system with a fatal exploit, an exploit that cannot be patched with more concrete or more wire. The night system was discontinued after the war. The U.S. Army returned to daylight-centered training. Night vision technology, starlight scopes, thermal imaging, made biological adaptation seem obsolete. But in doing so, the military lost something Allen had proven, that the most adaptable weapon system is not the one with the most advanced sensors, but the one that can operate when all sensors fail. Today, Special Operations Forces train in sensory deprivation as part of advanced skill sets. Navy SEALs conduct drown-proofing exercises in total darkness. Delta Force operators train in no-light, close-quarters battle. But these are elite units. Allen proved that ordinary soldiers, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, could be trained to the same level if given time and repetition. The question we should ask is not, how did they do it, but why did we stop? Because the answer reveals something uncomfortable about modern warfare. We have become dependent on technology to compensate for skills we have allowed to atrophy. We have traded adaptability for equipment. And equipment, as Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich learned in a bunker outside Cologne, can be bypassed by an enemy willing to train harder than you are willing to defend. The night fighters left no memorials. There are no statues of Terry Allen teaching soldiers to see in darkness. The training manuals were declassified and forgotten, but their legacy endures in a single undeniable truth. The most dangerous enemy is not the one with the best weapons. It is the one who is trained to fight in conditions where your weapons are irrelevant. When you step into total darkness for the first time in your life, your brain panics. It floods you with adrenaline. It creates hallucinations to fill the sensory void. It tells you that you are in danger, that you must find light, that survival depends on seeing. But if you stay in that darkness, if you breathe through the panic and wait, something remarkable happens. Your pupils dilate. Your hearing sharpens. Your skin becomes sensitive to air currents and temperature gradients. And you realize that darkness is not the absence of information. It is an environment filled with signals you were never trained to read. The night fighters learned to read those signals. And in doing so, they turned the Wehrmacht's greatest advantage, control of the night, into their greatest vulnerability. Could the Germans have countered this? Could they have trained their own soldiers in total darkness? Theoretically, yes, but it would have required 6 weeks of continuous training. 6 weeks their forces did not have, fighting a two-front war with collapsing logistics and manpower shortages. The night system was not a weapon that could be copied overnight. It was a neurological investment that required time Germany no longer possessed, and that, in the end, is the final lesson. The most powerful weapon in warfare is not the one that delivers the most explosive force. It is the one your enemy cannot replicate before the war is over. The night fighters disappeared into history. But on a cold February morning in 1945, they walked through a fortress designed by the finest military engineers in Europe, bypassed obstacles considered impassable, and captured an entire defensive line without firing a shot. They did not need light to win. They only needed darkness. And the enemy's absolute certainty that darkness could not be weaponized. That certainty was wrong, and it cost Germany the Rhine.